Welcome to the Changemakers Pod, the show that's focused on how we can collaborate for a better tomorrow, hosted by Zoetis. I'm Laura Olson, Senior Vice President of U.S. Pet Care at Zoetis.
And I'm Ed DeBoe, Vice President of Customer Care at Zoetis. We're here today to talk about evolving the customer experience with two very special guests, Simon T. Bailey and Scott Bedbury. Simon is a speaker, author, coach, entrepreneur who has more than 30 years of experience in the hospitality industry, including as sales director for Disney Institute. He was named by Success Magazine as one of the top 25 people who will help you reach your business and life goals.
And Scott is a speaker and CEO of BrandStream, a global brand consultancy group. Scott has helped shape some of the world's most iconic brands, such as Nike, Starbucks, and Airbnb, and has advised leaders across a wide range of industries, including healthcare, social media, and hospitality. We expect to have an enlightening conversation with these two experts today, who know how to create memorable connections and transform the customer experience. Whatever your reason for being here, we're happy you've joined us. Now let's welcome Scott and Simon to the Changemakers Pod.
Thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here and help you guys out. Really enjoyed the keynote presentation before.
Hi, Ed and Laura. So good to be with you. Thank you for having me and glad to share this time with you and Scott.
Thank you both for joining us today. Before we get underway, can you tell our listeners who may not have been on the town hall just a little bit about yourselves?
Well, for me, my purpose is very simple: to spark listeners to understand that customer service is a department, but customer love is a mindset. And I've had that opportunity to serve as a board member of a 100-year-old hospital, the Orlando Healthcare System, 20,000 employees. And I get to see how they create customer love or patient love every single day.
My background, if I look back across the 30 years, I think the common thread is helping companies transcend the product relationship and build meaningful experiences. For Nike, it was getting beyond talking about midsole cushioning, with large molecules of air trapped inside the thin, pliable midsole of a running shoe, to I Like to Just Do It campaign, which really was an effort to inspire rather than, help people aspire to be like Michael Jordan or somebody else. And then obviously at Starbucks too, there was a big shift. I called it transcending the cup, instead of just trying to tell America why a cappuccino, or a latte you could not live without. It was the music, the design, the treatment of the employees and the customers. And so every project I've taken on since, I've tried to make the companies better, not just bigger, and mostly around the experience they deliver when the day is done.
Really, thank you both. The last time we saw you was at our Changemakers virtual town hall back in March. Simon delivered the keynote address and then participated in a very insightful Q&A with Ed. And afterwards, Scott gave us a ton of fantastic takeaways during our fireside chat. We gained so much useful information and practical tips from you both during those sessions. And we really wanted to see what other advice you could share with our industry leaders if we had just a little bit more time. So let's jump right in.
Now, Simon, during your keynote, you shared with us how emotionally connecting with customers is essential. And with concierge service as the current norm in veterinary medicine, there are less obvious opportunities to really connect with pet owners than there used to be. And interactions with veterinary staff can feel much more transactional as a result. So how do you think we can connect better with our interactions with pet owners when they seem so limited right now?
Yeah, I think probably the first thing is to always remember to be human. Research says that small businesses only use the customer's name 21%, but 86% of customers would prefer to hear their name used. So I think right out the gate, that human experience is be human using their name. I think the second thing is to find out how they would like to interact for that limited amount of time. Is it phone? Is it text? Is it video? Is it email? Just what does that interaction really look like for them? And I think the third thing is capture the data. What do I mean by that? What was the first time they've ever worked with you, that they brought their pet to you? Document that. One of the things that Ritz-Carlton taught me when I did some work for Ritz-Carlton is that they will remember not only when you stayed with them, but if you ordered anything special. So if you go and stay at another Ritz-Carlton hotel, that thing that you ordered is in the system. So connecting with pet owners could simply mean, what's the birthday of their pet? What's that engagement, and keeping that information and creating an experience for them in that.
I was lucky enough to reposition the 5 Starwood brands, the St. Regis, the W, the Westin, the Sheraton, 4 Points. I think it was 2003 or 4. And what we did, it was a really simple exercise, which I took this experience with me when I helped Airbnb do their brand architecture about 6 years later, is the basic human needs, to feel loved, to love someone else, to feel welcome, to feel valued, to feel part of something bigger, to feel safe. I mean, just revisit your Maslow textbook from college, and you'll find them. And we literally laid out all 5 brands, and we basically, the brand leads on each of those brands had to put something in each of those boxes. So for every one of those human needs that we have, they had to say, here's how our flagship brand delivers that every day. And then they went further and broke it down by function, the front desk to housekeeping to customer service to reservations. So I think there's a really simple exercise there, which is to just treat people as human beings. We heard that from Simon. And I think just dig deep to these human needs that we all have. And sometimes we forget that we just walk into a room with those needs, and we respond very well when people recognize. And it's different too for men versus women. I found that as hip and cool as the W thought it was with its very dark hallways, wasn't really a hit with a lot of women, particularly walking into a dark room.
Yep.
So I think you really have to think about those emotional levers, and then find the right way to reach each of your key customer segments.
Yeah, we're certainly in a very emotionally charged time. And when we think about the parking lot drop off, and for those of us that have pets, we know these are members of our family. They might even be sick, and we're just handing them off. So connecting on a human level is really important. Both of you talked about treating customers as guests in your hospitality example. How can veterinary practices better understand their guest's journey so they can measure that experience, even improve on it?
Well, I think it's a really good question. And I think it's, again, a great exercise for anybody that's in sort of a public facing platform, and certainly veterinary clinics are there. Again, at Airbnb, I think it was 2012, Brian Chesky, the CEO, my client, seized upon the touch point work that we did at Starbucks. We focused on, I think it was 20. I don't think it was 70 like Disney had. But for every Starbucks store in North America, when I was there, they had a secret shopper go in and evaluate everything from the music. Was it the right music? Was it the right volume? Was the restroom clean? The front door clean? Blah, blah, blah. And how were mistakes handled? But I think what Airbnb did so well is we took the host journey from not being a host to, gee, I'm thinking about it. What's that journey like? How do they hit the site? What do they see? How do they get information about Airbnb? All the way through to their listing. And the moment of truth, by the way, for them, and Simon knows this too, you may have 10 or 20 or 70 touch points. There's a handful that mean a lot. And for the host, it was walking back into your home after you rented it the first time. And we did the same for the guest, the guest journey from wanting to be a guest to actually finding the place, and that gap between making the reservation and getting there. And again, for them, the moment of truth was the key, or the code. Did it actually work? And then when you walked in the room, what did you smell? What did you see? Did the neighborhood feel safe? And that's a great exercise, but you got to go beyond that. You have to map it and you have to measure it. And then you have to focus on those that matter most, and then hold people accountable to those things.
Scott, that's really fascinating. I remember years ago when I started my career in marketing, I read an article about Virgin Atlantic, and they did a lot of consumer journey mapping. This was early on, before it was as mainstream perhaps as it is today. And in that article, they shared that as they did their research, they found that the biggest pain point for travelers was the commute to the airport. So they decided that they could differentiate themselves by supporting that commute through ground transportation. So it's really interesting, to your point, sometimes it's not at all about the experience that you would think it is. It's completely different, and it's a minor detail can make a big impact. So thank you for that story. It's very important. Simon, in your keynote, you shared your 5 platinum service principles based upon the SPARK acronym for creating lifelong customers. These principles are the focus of your book, Be the Spark. Can you give our listeners today just a little bit more insight in how to accomplish that?
A couple of years ago, I was invited by the wonderful folks at ChickfilA to share with 5,000 other operators. And I asked Dan, Kathy, and his brother Bubba, who are the sons of the founder, I said, help me understand, you make more money per square foot than anybody else in the quick service space, but you're closed on Sunday. Help me with that math. And he said, Simon, we're not in the chicken business, we're in the people business, and we just happen to sell chicken. And I went to their location, and what I began to understand is Chick-fil-A has totally vujade the customer experience, because that experience is just 2 minutes. But what they do in that 2 minutes, they actually ask you, and what is your name? What other quick service restaurant does that? What is your name? And then at the end of that transaction, they say, thank you, my pleasure. Now, the other interesting thing that they've done is Chick-fil-A realized that they need to take time out of the equation. So they were one of the first to have iPads literally to take people's orders outside. I've noticed that Starbucks is now doing the same thing, but it's taking that time out and personalizing that experience. Once again, what's your name? Thank you for coming, 2 minutes. So I think the ability to really kind of step back and look for that opportunity to connect, not just communicate.
Simon, Scott mentioned the 70 Disney touch points.
Yes.
I thought maybe you could share a little bit about that as well.
So when I first joined Disney, the first couple of days I spent at Disney University, and one of the things you begin to understand that you're not there to do a job, but you're there to create a moment. I'll say it to a different way. Disneyland is not in the business of selling tickets for people to come to the park. They're in the business of making sure you walk away with a magical moment. And it's just that shift in thinking. So when I was listening to Scott, it reminded me of my time at Disney, that the 70 touch points are an emotional deposit into the emotional bank account of the guest, is what we would call it, right? And I think for those that are listening to us right now, walk a mile in the shoes of your customer. Literally, and yes, you should hire a secret shopper, as Scott articulated, but I think you should actually shop your experience. What is it like? What did you see? What did you hear? And then you'll understand, like Disney taught me, it's not about the individual interaction, it's a cluster of interactions. And where is it an opportunity to surprise and delight the guest, that they're like, whoa, what just happened? That becomes a touch point. And then how do you go back to the staff and say, here's the moment to connect?
Going back to Scott, building on what Simon said, how would you create this inclusive customer experience? Pets are like humans, everyone is different, right? So how do we meet each customer where they want to be?
I think one of the things to, and I've often threatened, I really want to write a book about what I learned as a waiter. Because I learned a bunch in college, I learned a bunch in my professional career, but the observational skills of a good waiter are those are life skills. And there's some people who definitely want to talk. They want to talk to you. And this was I worked in a pretty nice restaurant, white tablecloth. And there are other people, maybe because they're just hopeless romantics and they're just fascinated with each other. They don't want to be interrupted about anything, And I also learned early on as a waiter to card every woman, no matter her age. So she could be 60 years old. And I would say, I'm sorry, ma'am, I'm gonna have to check your ID before I can serve you some wine. I've seen this at play with my own mother-in-law. In fact, I'll take a waiter aside and say, can you be sure to card my mother-in-law before the night's out? So I think that's part of it. I was helping Samsung years ago. This was probably 7 or 8 years ago, and they were interested in a flagship store. And Nike Town was pretty bold. That was 1989. That was 10 years before Apple made its first flagship store. So I try and help every brand, make it as good as it can possibly be, at least somewhere once. Learn from it. It's like a laboratory, right? Anyway, so I had the global head of marketing for Samsung with me in New York. We visited a couple Apple stores. Again, this was 9 years ago, and Apple was really killing it. And she was overwhelmed because we were approached 2 or 3 times by people. Again, they had the smartphone to do the transactions. That was kind of new, but kept asking, everything okay? It's something I can help you with? It was just amazing, right? And then finally she goes, that's it. She walks back to the last guy that we spoke to and she said, can I ask you a question? And he said, why, certainly. And she said, do you like your job? And he said, "Are you kidding me? I get to bring inspiration and joy to people every day. I love my job." So I did some background on it. And what I realized is that all those Apple employees had just finished a module in their training simply titled Empathy. And what they do is it was taught just that people are walking in, they're overwhelmed by technology. They may not show it. They may be frustrated. They may actually be angry right under the surface because got a laptop that doesn't work. So I think a lot of it's observation, but it's also creating that culture of just really being present with the customer and being willing to meet whatever needs they have.
Yeah, Scott, that's great. As Ed mentioned previously, for a lot of our customers right now, they're in a curbside environment. So they're driving up to the veterinary clinic, placing a phone call, the technicians coming out to get their animal. So it's not as personable, and there's less opportunities for those direct connections that we may have had in the pre-COVID world. Do you have any thoughts on what veterinary practices can do given this environment to distinguish themselves from the hospital down the road? How can they make that personal touch even in this environment?
I think brand differentiation it's the game. It's always the game, right? And I think sometimes we forget that it's the little things that matter. It's not necessarily price or hours open and all that. And I think it's just that creating that sense of everything matters, which was a mantra at Starbucks. It was like a 2-word, it was never really written down anywhere. But that meant the cleanliness of the restroom mattered, which, by the way, for women with small children was the #1 most important thing when choosing a coffee house, believe it or not. It's crazy. But everything mattered meant, how do you treat your fellow employee or partner, as we called it? How you resolve mistakes and problems with the customers. But what it meant was, and I can only imagine trying to worry about 70 touch points. That makes my brain hurt. But to to give up on anything is failure. And I know it's hard to focus on everything at once, but I think if you create a culture that says even the littlest things matter, it adds up to a lot. And again, a little thing is just eye contact. At Starbucks, we trained the baristas to verbally or visually greet a customer, and no matter if the line is 20 deep, within a minute of walking in the door. And it can be just a head nod too. And you might recognize the guy that's there every morning at 8:30 that gets a double tall, not too hot, latte like me, and actually start working on that drink. This is back before pre-ordering and all that. But I think it's that just a number of little things that in the end, I think end up setting brands apart in my mind.
Scott, you've said that the most powerful brands are built on community and how they're perceived across that community. How can veterinary practices incorporate this sense of community to help create, foster, and grow their bond with their customers?
It's a really good question. I did some consulting for a pizza chain. I won't name it here. Years ago, and I was trying to figure out who was actually defining the brand at its best. And I looked at all the numbers, and you look at the revenue numbers, and I dug a little deeper, and I looked at just sort of, the community, sort of the social chatter, if you will, the sentiment analysis about that brand and that particular zip code. And I found that the person running that, just a franchisee, and he put all of his marketing every year into free pizza for Little League awards banquets. So the Little League soccer team, the Little League baseball, Pop Warner football, whatever it was, he'd get with the teams each year at the beginning and say, just put it on your calendar so I know when you're coming and I'll take care of the pizza. And he was gold with the community. So I think that's definitely one way to do it. But then to become a protagonist, in this case, for animal health is a very big idea. And that gets you well outside the veterinary clinic, right? I worked for Kaiser Permanente and repositioning them in the early 2000s. And they spent a lot of time and money on helping make healthier communities, like tackling things like food deserts. But one of the things they did, and it stunned me that it was like even an issue, was actually to pay to lobby a city or a community to get a crosswalk painted, a safe one for children to get to school, or to lobby for a shoulder for kids to ride their bikes and walk on. So there's sort of, I call those almost like activist things where you sort of step up and you get outside your 4 walls and do something that is meaningful to the community.
That's great. I mean, and what we know from a lot of research we've done at Zoetis, and I'm sure a lot of our customers have as well, is that the Millennials and the Gen Zers, that is so important to them. They really want to engage with brands that share their values.
I was talking with a colleague yesterday and I asked her about her pet. And she said, "Do you know that my pet has its own Instagram page and has more followers than I do?" So what would it be like to have someone on your team that engages from a social media standpoint with pets who have their own Instagram page? But another idea is, what if you put on a pet Oscars where each of your customers submit a video that goes on a fan page, and every one of your customers votes on the pet that does something interesting via video, and you literally endear yourself or Velcro yourself to that customer because you recognize what's important to them. So pet Oscars, just a thought.
Love it.
It's great.
That's a great idea.
Even before COVID, changes were occurring in the veterinary industry. This pandemic has definitely accelerated those changes and added even more pressure to change. For example, pet owners routinely search the internet, right, for cost comparisons. Many prefer the convenience of purchasing online versus in the veterinary clinic. Others, you might have a question late on a Friday night, and with the speed of the internet, you just don't want to wait until Monday to talk with someone about it.
So true, Ed. It's harder and harder in today's world to keep the pet owner's trust and attention within the babble of information from the internet and ads and social media. During COVID, practices adjusted very quickly. As you mentioned earlier, they're providing online purchasing, telemedicine, and concierge services. Simon, what can the veterinary industry learn from these changes, and how can veterinarians remain at the center of care and continue to meet their customers' evolving needs?
Yeah, I think the first thing is those that will thrive and flourish during this time understand how to be easy and simple. Don't forget those two things. Are you easy to do business with, and do you keep it simple? So, point in case, there's a recent article about how Zoom has won the battle in the online space because they kept it simple and easy. So, when your pet owners engage with you in even an online standpoint, what do they do? When do they do it? How do they do it? For a few years ago, I was invited by VRBO, or Vacation Rental by Owner, to do a session, and they wanted me to teach this whole thing about Spark. And I was backstage, and I talked to the speaker that went before me. And he was a data scientist, and I said, "What do you do at VRBO?" And he says, "My entire responsibility is every ad to look at the facial recognition to see what customers are doing." So I think every veterinary clinic should be thinking, "Oh my goodness, what is the data telling us? How is it informing how we interact with that customer?"
There's been an increase in pet ownership during the pandemic, predominantly among millennials and Gen Zers. And these particular groups are really demanding convenience and transparency. And as I said earlier, right, they really want to connect with companies that share their values. Do you have advice on how veterinary practices can connect specifically with these segments?
I'll jump in on that one. I have two millennials. Son is 32, daughter's 25. We got that right. And I'm amazed by how different they are than so many other generations, right? And now you've got obviously the Zers coming behind them. I think and again, super important here. Don't treat them all the same. You can pick
Yep.
up a millennial study and say, well, here's the 5 things we should treat every millennial with, because they're very different. And particularly now, I think this country, particularly the United States, has become somewhat fragmented, if you will, in terms of values and beliefs and whatnot. But I think the best thing you can do is recognize, more than any other generation, I think they look for trust. They look for integrity, both in terms of how the company operates, but how it treats its employees, how it treats its community, environmental impact, all those things. And they'll hunt that down. They'll find that information. And I think they also just want experiences. They more than anybody. And I watch my kids and their friends. They're not going to go to the same restaurant 2 nights in a row or on 2 consecutive weekends. They'll find a Thai restaurant somewhere they've never been to, in a very sketchy part of Seattle somewhere that I would probably never go to. But they're craving experiences they can do socially. So post-pandemic, that is going to come roaring back like you can't believe. But I think you need to study them both, avoid overgeneralizations, and perhaps more important than anything, talk to them. Just talk to them. Particularly if you jump in an Uber and you notice you've got a 22-year-old driver, get to know them. What's their world like? I do this all the time. I'm a nonstop focus group machine. Wherever I go, I'm always talking to everybody because there's always something to learn.
Yeah, I would simply say, understand that millennials and Gen Z are focused on making meaning instead of money. So anytime
Mm.
that you can share how you are impacting a pet shelter in your local community, I think goes a long way with them. And then the other thing is look at the rage of TikTok. What would it be like to, in 15 seconds, educate, make a point, humanize the brand of how and why you do what you do, because certainly that's where millennials and GZ spend a lot of time.
Thanks, Simon. Following up on that question and what you talked about earlier, Scott, about incorporating community and that good karma and public service component, how can a hospital, whether it's an individual practice or a larger veterinary service provider, take the values that they believe in to the next level? How can they project those values into their community?
That's a really good question and timely too, because I think our values now in this transparent world we live in, we have to walk what we talk. And if we don't, consumers don't suffer that very well. Again, Airbnb, a good example on this one. I think we had 22 core values when I first worked on the brand architecture with them. And particularly Joe and Brian, the two of the co-founders, had 22 core values, and they thought each of them were as important, is the next one. And I said, no one can remember 22 core values. We got to get this down. I said, Nike's got like 3, authentic athletic performance, and of course it's a little more than that now. It took us 6 months to get it to like 15. And then one night I announced, I came in at 6 o'clock. I said, nobody leaves the conference room until we get it to 10. I left at 2 in the morning. And to eliminate those other, because we collapsed a lot of them, but for these young guys who are, I think, 29, maybe 30, it was like for them choosing among their unborn children, right? Because they just thought they were all so important. But here's the thing, we weren't just doing those values for their employees. We were trying to instill those in every host, in every guest, every touch point along the way. So I think the worst thing you can do is confine your values to a piece of paper framed on the wall of your, waiting room. And the best thing you can do is, and use the word infection in a positive way, is infect the community with everybody understands what it means to be that brand and how they behave and how their employees behave. And it will rub off on customers. I think there's a human kindness thing that is like a contagion if you can start it in the right way. But I'm always amazed at the companies that look beyond even their own employees. Like we just focus on our employees, or we might focus on the customer. And I think in the end, brands will live, or die or thrive based on the strength across probably a dozen touch points in the community. So I think there are ways to, again, get out of your 9 dots. And I know it's hard in this COVID thing, we'll get there, but to get out into the community and to share what you love and what you believe in, it can have a very lasting effect rather than sitting in an examination room or the waiting room or worse yet in the parking lot.
Yeah, I would say, building on everything that Scott just shared, we've often heard that culture eats strategy for lunch. So I would encourage to focus on culture. Everything I learned at Disney and Nordstrom, it's all about culture. Culture is the alignment of head, heart, and hands, so that the feet can follow, right? So facts tell, stories sell. And I think if you're really going to impact the community, they want an authentic, consistent story of the culture where everyone matters. And when you have that culture where everyone matters, you don't have to advertise your way into a person's head or heart. They will begin to yelp about your brand because they know that the culture is something that you live from the inside out.
Totally agree with that.
And it's so important in this day and age. The millennials and the Gen Zers, they live in a social world and they're really comfortable leveraging their broader network and ecosystem for medical advice. So some of our veterinary customers are wondering, how do they still remain at that center of care? And how do we help ensure that they are part of this broader ecosystem?
Wow, I love this question. So first of all, you can Google anything, right? Google is
Mhm.
full of information. I believe everyone listening to us right now is what supersedes information is insight. So for example, I was doing some work with a hospital years ago, and there are 4 different learning styles in a hospital. The doctors have a learning style, nurses have a learning style, admin has a learning style, employees have a learning style. And they say sometimes the nurses have a better rapport because they know the patient and they can share that information with doctors. But here's the point. I think everyone listening to us, you have insight into that pet that you just can't Google and get information. And once you share that insight, you become the trusted advisor. So everyone listening to us, you want to become the trusted advisor for the insightful perception that you have about that pet. And I think that allows you to raise the margins on cost of what you charge, because it's one thing to hear, it's another thing to know.
The thing that keeps bouncing around in my head too, particularly with millennials, and getting it back to how do you set yourself apart, kind of a roll up on this, but I took my daughter's dog to a new pet, we don't want to call it a kennel, for a few days, and they loved him. They told us how much they loved him, and we went home. We went back to their website, and there was Dude on the front page. And when I thought that, well, that's clever. So maybe every night somebody goes in and pops, the dogs that are there, which I think is a great idea. He's still on the page 2 years later. So if you want to win somebody's heart, show you care. But I think there's ways to do that more than just, once every 2 years. But to take an interest in a pet, because I know for a lot of people, and I have brothers and sisters who don't have children, and their pets are, I would say, closer to them than some parents are with their children that I've observed in my life. So I think we can only underestimate that. And to follow up on Simon's point, it's just listen, be aware of what matters to them about that relationship, and pay attention to that and support that.
Yeah, I mean, what we do know is amongst millennials and Gen Zers, they're putting off having children and instead are having pets. So we talked a lot about what we should do. Any tips on what our customers should not do?
I would say, please, ma'am, please, sir, don't be inconsistent. If you start and stop, you're going to be toast. There's a hotel in Chicago called the Langham Hotel, and they're #1 in TripAdvisor.com and have been since 2013. And I happened to be staying there and went to work out in the facility, and they have this sign called Chasing Consistency. And I totally got why they were #1. I think the other thing is that you want to avoid is over-promising and under-delivering. I think that's critically important, because a brand is an emotion, a connection, a perception, a moment, and a memory. And if you overpromise and don't deliver, that creates a moment and a memory that is a withdrawal from the emotional bank account.
I totally agree with Simon's point there. I think the transparency we live in now is changing everything. The working title to the book I've been writing for 4 years, which is just now almost finished, the working title was No More Secrets, No More Strangers. So how do you build trust in a world where you really can't hide, and we're seeing this all the time. The editor for, was it Sassy or 17 magazine, sort of losing her job even before she showed up to work because of some tweets she did or some social media years ago. So I think it's, everything matters. I think it's recognize that transparency can be an asset or a liability. And I think if you're going to be inconsistent, it's going to be a liability, to Simon's point. And it doesn't take very many contradictions of you not being who you say you are to create a problem for yourself. Back to the culture comment, and I agree so much with what Simon said about this. You really do need to measure your cultural connection. I added a line to our ongoing employee or partner survey at Starbucks. My head of HR thought I was crazy. I said, I want to ask customers how they feel about our mission, vision, and values, and are we honoring them? Or are we compromising them, is a question, right? And she goes, why would you do that? And I said, well, it's sort of like, I want to create a karmometer. I want to know what the karma is like inside the company, because we were going from opening one store a day to, one store a week to one a day in the first year I was there. And then it was 3 stores 2 years later a day. So that torsional flux was incredible. And a lot of people felt that the company was selling out to chase Wall Street expectations, as you can imagine, right? So we did that, and we found some of our best people. And by the way, the first people to leave you are usually your best employees, because they can get a job somewhere else. Your worst employees will be there when you're out of business and someone turns the lights off. So I think to look within the organization to understand how strong you are with your people and are you living up to your values, and then arc that out, ask your customers and do some surveys. But it does come down to culture and embracing transparency as an asset and not to fear it.
As we begin to wrap up, thanks for everything you've shared with us. But I wanted to ask, are there any final, tangible, actionable tips? If there was that one thing we could leave and do today or tomorrow, what would you tell our listeners about how to evolve their customer experience?
Well, first of all, I just want to say I can listen to Scott all day. This is like a mini MBA on steroids. And just understand
Agree.
business. So good. So everything that I've learned in all the different companies that I've been in is that leaders create the experience for employees, employees create the experience for customers, and customers drive revenue. Reverse engineer. Revenue comes from happy customers who have been engaged by employees who work for an emotionally connected leader. So I think leaders really understanding where employees are right now. All the research says that many are experiencing burnout, mental health issues, depression. So how does the organization really shift from human doing to human beings, really thinking about that? And then I created just a practical term that I coined in my book. And it's really an acronym. How do we acknowledge them immediately? How do we make a memorable connection, add a special touch? So I go through Clear when I'm at the airport, and Clear gives me this little hand sanitizer. I was like, wow, right? Just something simple, a little special touch. How do we zero in on the emotional level? And then how do we end with a lasting impression? Because everything Disney taught me was about warm welcomes and fond farewells.
I think the last thing I would focus on, again, it's kind of a nice wrap up. And by the way, Simon, I'm floored by what you've been saying too. So we've got a fan club of two here of each other. This has been fun. My favorite chapter in the book I'm finishing now is simply titled "Be Superhuman." And I think in a world where we're so awash in artificial intelligence, and we've got so many relationships that we're trying to manage or stay on top of, and the burnout is palpable. And the chapter opens up after a shoot with Michael Jordan forever ago. I think it was, oh my God, 1991. He just won his first NBA championship. And we're shooting at the Forum on a Sunday morning. This is before everybody had a cell phone, so we could be pretty quiet. Nobody knew we were there. We were shooting the Air Jordan Super Bowl commercial, which was the inspiration for Space Jam a few years later. Anyway, we left, and I had to get him in the car and to the hotel very quickly. And but that wasn't to be, because there were about 150 kids outside. So somehow the word got out that Michael was at the Forum. Must have been the production trucks or something, I don't know. And I tried to tug him away, and he was going to get fined by the team. We were going to get back to the hotel, so it's kind of on me. So finally, I convinced him to come to the car and get moving. And he stood back from a rope we had assembled between the exit door and his town car. And he stood there for almost 2 minutes, just looking at the crowd about 10 feet away. And I'm like, did we forget somebody? Because sometimes with athletes, they have a posse, they got a friend of a friend, a son of somebody to come meet them or whatever. And he finally walks away, and I said, was there someone we're supposed to get? Did we forget somebody? And he said, no. He said, if I think a kid has waited like 4 hours to see me, and I can't sign something for him, or I can't say hi, the least I can do is look him in the eye. Mm. Now, if you
wow,
now, not everybody's a Michael Jordan, and he could have just put his baseball hat down and just walked away, right? We forget there are a lot of people in this world that look up to us, our children, our peers, people at work, and a lot of the quiet people that just, they may never really tell you how they feel about something. So I think, again, back to the little things, he just made eye contact with every kid that he knew he couldn't talk to. So my parting advice, and it's ironic, in a world where everything's about the animals, be superhuman.
Thank you both so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you for the invitation. It's been great. Glad to help.
Thank you, Lauren, Ed, and Scott. It's been a joy.
So thank you for tuning in to the second Change Makers podcast hosted by Zoetis. We hope you've really enjoyed getting some extra insights from the speakers from our town hall series.